Snow pressed softly against the windshield of a county cruiser as dawn broke over a quiet Tennessee back road. What lay beyond the ditch line did not scream or bleed, but waited, cold and deliberate, wrapped in silence, demanding careful hands, measured breaths, and the patience of evidence to speak. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. In December of 1992, the small town of Hollow Creek, Tennessee, settled into its familiar winter rhythms. Christmas lights hung from courthouse lampposts. Church bulletins listed Advent services. Older men lingered over coffee at dawn, discussing weather fronts and football standings. It was the kind of place where routines mattered and disruptions carried weight. When 22-year-old Emily Harper failed to arrive at her parents' home for a scheduled Sunday dinner on December 13, the absence registered immediately. Emily was a recent community college graduate, working part-time at a local insurance office, saving money with quiet determination. She was known for punctuality, for calling ahead, for leaving notes. None were found. By nightfall, concern turned into structured worry, and Hollow Creek police logged a missing person report before the Christmas wreaths. Outside the station had time to collect ice. Initial steps followed standard procedure. Officers confirmed Emily's last known movements through bank timestamps, employer logs, and a brief canvass of her apartment complex. Her car, a blue 1988 Ford Escort, remained parked in its assigned space, windows frosted from disuse. Inside her apartment, nothing appeared disturbed. A small artificial tree stood undecorated near the window, a cardboard box of ornaments still sealed. Her purse sat on the kitchen counter. There were no signs of forced entry, no obvious struggle, and no evidence of planned travel. The absence itself became the anomaly. On the morning of December 15, 2 days after the report, a county road maintenance worker noticed something unusual while clearing debris near a culvert along State Route 41, several miles outside town. Tire tracks cut into frozen mud at an odd angle, inconsistent with routine traffic. He alerted authorities. When deputies arrived, they treated the scene as a potential accident site until they saw what lay beyond the tree line, partially obscured by winter brush. The discovery shifted the investigation instantly from missing person to suspected homicide. Emily Harper was found in a shallow embankment, shielded from the road by scrub pine and leafless briars. There were no overt signs of violence visible from a distance. Her clothing was intact. The position of her body suggested she had been placed rather than fallen. Officers secured the area, documenting footprints, tire impressions, and disturbed soil before the sun could alter them. The temperature remained below freezing, preserving details that might otherwise have been lost. Photographs were taken methodically. Measurements were recorded. A perimeter was established, and Hollow Creek's quiet winter morning gave way to the hum of radios and the scrape of evidence markers pressing into frost. The autopsy, conducted later that day in the county medical examiner's facility, provided the first clear outline of what had happened. Emily's death was ruled a homicide. The cause was consistent with asphyxiation, indicated by internal findings rather than external trauma. There were no defensive injuries noted on her hands or arms, suggesting compliance or incapacitation. Toxicology would later reveal trace levels of a sedative, commonly prescribed but not found among Emily's medications. Time of death was estimated between late evening on December 12 and early morning on December 13, aligning with the window after she was last seen leaving her workplace holiday gathering. That gathering, a modest office potluck held on Friday evening, became a focal point. Attendance lists were compiled. Witnesses were interviewed in a controlled, repetitive manner designed to test consistency. Emily had left alone shortly after 8, 11:00 p.m., declining an invitation to continue the evening elsewhere. Her route home should have taken 10 minutes along well-traveled roads. Somewhere within that short span, her routine was interrupted. Investigators expanded their scope. Roadside businesses along Emily's route were revisited for receipts, employee recollections, and any surveillance footage, though in 1992 such footage was sparse and often overwritten. Gas station clerks recalled nothing unusual. A cashier remembered a young woman matching Emily's description purchasing gum earlier that evening, but the timestamp was imprecise. Weather reports were reviewed, noting light snowfall beginning around 9:30 p.m., a detail that would later matter when reconstructing vehicle movement. Media attention intensified as Christmas approached. The local paper ran Emily's photograph on the front page beneath a restrained headline. Missing person flyers transitioned into memorial notices. Candlelight vigils were held on the courthouse steps, attended largely by older residents who understood loss as a quiet, cumulative thing. Tips came in steadily, many well-intentioned, few actionable. Each was logged, cross-referenced, and archived in thick manila folders that would eventually line a dedicated shelf in the evidence room. Early suspects included a former boyfriend, co-workers, and a man reported to have been seen loitering near Emily's apartment weeks earlier. All were interviewed, some more than once. Alibis were checked against work schedules, phone records, and third-party confirmations. None withstood scrutiny long enough to justify charges. Physical evidence from the scene was limited but carefully preserved. Soil samples from the tire tracks, fibers recovered from Emily's coat, and a partial latent print lifted from a discarded beverage container found near the embankment. At the time, the print did not match any local records. By New Year's Day, 1993, the case had settled into a difficult phase. Leads dwindled. Detectives rotated assignments but returned regularly to Emily Harper's file. The holidays passed with an unspoken understanding in Hollow Creek that something had been taken and not returned. For the men who followed the case, many of them nearing retirement, it became a measure of unfinished duty. The file remained open, active, and unresolved, waiting for a future method, a future comparison, a future answer that 1992 could not yet provide. January settled heavily over Hollow Creek, bringing gray skies and administrative patience rather than answers. Detectives returned to fundamentals, reviewing timelines, re-interviewing witnesses, and re-examining every item logged during December. Emily Harper's movements on the evening of December 12th were reconstructed minute by minute using receipts, phone logs, and witness recollections. At 7:58 p.m., she clocked out of the insurance office, said brief goodbyes, and walked alone to her car. Nothing unusual was reported in the parking lot, and no nearby business recorded suspicious activity. The lack of disturbance suggested Emily entered her vehicle voluntarily, a conclusion supported by the absence of defensive injuries. Investigators theorized she may have been stopped along the road by someone she recognized or trusted. Attention turned to men who routinely traveled State Route 41 during late evening hours. Vehicle registration records were pulled, focusing on trucks and vans capable of leaving the tire impressions documented near the embankment. This produced dozens of names, many belonging to residents with long histories in the county. Each was contacted, interviewed, and cleared or retained based on corroborated alibis. One individual drew early interest, a 43-year-old maintenance contractor named Thomas Reed. Reed lived alone outside town and regularly drove the route where Emily was found. He owned a light-colored pickup truck with tires similar in width to those measured at the scene. When questioned, Reed acknowledged being on the road that night but claimed to have driven straight home after work. His timeline left a 40-minute gap unaccounted for, which he attributed to stopping at a closed convenience store. Officers visited the location and confirmed no such stop would have been possible at that hour. Despite inconsistencies, there was insufficient evidence in 1993 to move forward with charges. Reed denied knowing Emily Harper, and no witness placed them together. Without physical proof, investigators could only note his name and continue. The case entered a prolonged dormant phase as months turned into years. Emily's parents kept her bedroom unchanged, maintaining routines that anchored them through grief. Every December, the local paper revisited the case in a brief column, urging anyone with information to come forward. Advances in forensic science during the late 1990s quietly reshaped investigative possibilities. In 1999, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation reviewed unsolved cases suitable for DNA reanalysis. Emily Harper's file was among those selected, owing to preserved biological evidence from her clothing. Fibers and trace samples collected in 1992 were submitted to updated laboratory testing. Results did not immediately identify a suspect, but produced a partial genetic profile suitable for future comparison. That profile was entered into national databases and remained dormant for nearly 2 decades. Meanwhile, Thomas Reed moved counties, changed employers, and accumulated minor arrests unrelated to violent crime. Nothing linked him directly to Emily's death beyond early circumstantial suspicion. The case was periodically audited, each review reaffirming the need for a definitive evidentiary bridge. That bridge arrived unexpectedly in the fall of 2018. A routine traffic stop in western Tennessee resulted in Reed's arrest for driving under the influence. As part of booking procedures, his DNA was collected and entered into state databases. Weeks later, analysts noted a partial match with the genetic profile from Emily Harper's case. Further testing strengthened the correlation beyond coincidence. Investigators reopened the file formally, assembling a multi-agency task force. Archived evidence was retrieved from climate-controlled storage and re-examined with modern methods. Soil samples from the embankment were compared to material found years later in Reed's old truck bed liner. The composition matched within acceptable forensic margins. Phone records from 1992, once incomplete, were reconstructed through billing archives. They placed Reed's phone moving along State Route 41 during the critical window. Witness statements from the original investigation were recontextualized under this new framework. A former coworker recalled Reed returning to work unusually quiet days after Emily's disappearance. At the time, the comment carried no significance. Now it became part of a cumulative evidentiary pattern. Prosecutors were consulted early to ensure constitutional compliance. A warrant was obtained for Reed's arrest in December 2019. He was taken into custody without incident, ending 27 years of unanswered questions. The arrest of Thomas Reed reopened old wounds in Hollow Creek and forced a reckoning long delayed. For many residents, the name had faded into the background of routine life, remembered only dimly as one of many early leads. Now it returned with legal weight. Investigators moved carefully, aware that decades between crime and arrest demanded precision rather than urgency. Reed was charged with first-degree murder based on newly established forensic linkage, pending indictment by a grand jury. He was held without bond at the county detention facility, as evidence was organized for judicial review. The renewed investigation focused on transforming correlation into proof beyond reasonable doubt. Analysts documented the chain of custody for every piece of physical evidence preserved since 1992. Laboratory technicians testified to storage conditions, handling protocols, and testing methodologies. The partial DNA profile recovered from Emily Harper's clothing was shown to be consistent with Reed's genetic markers at multiple loci, a match probability reaching into the billions. Defense experts would later question degradation and contamination, but documentation demonstrated intact seals and uninterrupted preservation. Investigators reconstructed Reed's movements on the night of December 12th using contemporaneous records and modern analysis. Fuel purchase logs indicated he bought gasoline earlier that evening at a station several miles south of Hollow Creek. Weather data showed snowfall beginning shortly after his documented purchase, aligning with the tire impressions found near the embankment. Soil composition analysis revealed a distinctive clay and gravel mixture, unique to the stretch of State Route 41, where Emily was discovered. Samples retrieved from Reed's former truck bed liner during a consented search matched that mixture in mineral content and particle size. Further corroboration came from toxicology. The sedative found in Emily Harper's system was identified as a medication prescribed to Reed for a back injury in late 1992. Pharmacy records confirmed he filled the prescription days before the crime. No evidence suggested Emily had access to the substance through legitimate means. The convergence of DNA, soil, vehicle pattern analysis, and pharmaceutical records established a cohesive narrative consistent with abduction and homicide. Witness testimony, long dormant, gained renewed significance. Former neighbors of Reed recalled unusual late-night vehicle activity during that winter, though none could specify dates at the time. Under oath, their statements were cautious and limited to observed patterns rather than conclusions. A retired coworker testified that Reed missed work without explanation the Monday following Emily's disappearance, a deviation from his otherwise reliable attendance. None of these elements alone proved guilt. Together, they reinforced the forensic core of the case. The indictment was returned in early 2020, and pretrial motions extended the timeline as defense counsel sought suppression of evidence and dismissal based on delay. The court rejected these motions, citing lawful evidence collection and the absence of prosecutorial misconduct. Trial was scheduled for the following year, delayed briefly by public health restrictions that affected court operations statewide. Throughout, Emily Harper's family attended hearings quietly, carrying the weight of time rather than anger. The trial unfolded with methodical restraint. Prosecutors presented evidence in chronological order, emphasizing procedure over emotion. Jurors were guided through the original investigation, the limitations of 1992 forensic science, and the technological advances that eventually closed the gap. Expert witnesses explained DNA analysis in clear terms, contextualizing probability without exaggeration. Defense arguments focused on the absence of eyewitnesses and the possibility of coincidental matches, but cross-examination reinforced the strength of cumulative evidence. After deliberating for 3 days, the jury returned a unanimous verdict of guilty. Thomas Reed was convicted of first-degree murder. At sentencing, the court imposed life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after the statutory minimum, acknowledging both the severity of the crime and the passage of time. No statements were made beyond the formal record. The courtroom remained subdued, reflecting the nature of the case itself. In the weeks that followed, Hollow Creek returned to its routines. The local paper printed a final article, noting the conviction without embellishment. Emily Harper's name was spoken again in public spaces, not as a question but as a conclusion. Her parents closed her case file at home, placing clippings and letters into a single box. For investigators, many now retired, The resolution marked the end of a professional obligation carried quietly for decades. The embankment along State Route 41 remains unchanged, an unremarkable stretch of winter brush and roadside gravel. There is no marker, no sign. Yet within county archives, the file labeled Harper, Emily, December 1992 is now stamped solved. It stands as a record of patience, preservation, and the eventual reach of evidence. In Hollow Creek, Christmas lights still hang each December, and the past rests, finally documented and complete. After the verdict, the case entered its final, quieter chapter, defined less by courtroom drama and more by administrative closure. Sentencing documentation was filed, appeals deadlines were logged, and evidence inventories were updated to reflect adjudicated status. The county clerk sealed sensitive exhibits according to statute, while certified copies of the judgment were transmitted to state repositories. For Hollow Creek, the process mattered. Men who had watched the case age alongside them valued the orderliness of the ending, the sense that procedures had held. Thomas Reed was transferred to a state correctional facility in early spring. Intake assessments noted age, health, and prior record. His projected parole eligibility was calculated under the law in effect at the time of the offense. There were no public statements, no spectacle, and no claims that could alter the verdict. The legal system moved on as it was designed to do, carrying the weight of a single life sentence into a larger ledger. For investigators, closure required verification. Supervisors conducted a final audit, confirming that every evidentiary link presented at trial matched the archival record. The audit confirmed lawful collection, uninterrupted custody, and appropriate testing standards. The review concluded with a memorandum summarizing the case's trajectory from 1992 to conviction, emphasizing the preservation choices that proved decisive. The memorandum was circulated internally as a training reference, a reminder that patience and documentation can outlast technology gaps. Emily Harper's timeline was finalized for the public record. Born in 1970, raised in a county shaped by seasonal work and church calendars, she had navigated early adulthood with cautious independence. At 22, her routines were modest and consistent. Investigators documented her final day with restraint. Work completed, brief social contact, departure into winter darkness, interruption, and death. The language remained clinical, honoring facts without intrusion. The forensic narrative settled into clarity. The sedative source was established through pharmacy logs and prescription verification. The soil correspondence met accepted thresholds for associative evidence. The DNA profile achieved statistical significance when compared to Reed's sample, and the probability statements were affirmed on appeal review. None of these elements required embellishment. Their strength lay in convergence, not drama. Hollow Creek's records reflected the community's response. Letters to the editor thanked law enforcement without assigning heroism. Clergy notes referenced endurance and responsibility rather than absolution. A small scholarship fund was established in Emily's name at the community college, funded quietly by local donors who preferred anonymity. Its purpose was practical, supporting tuition assistance for students pursuing office administration, the field Emily had entered. Winter returned again, as it always does. Courthouse wreaths were rehung, and the square filled with familiar sounds. Older men paused at the same counters, reading the paper and nodding the absence of updates. The case no longer needed reminders. Its resolution had entered common memory as a settled fact. The embankment along State Route 41 was revisited by a survey crew unrelated to the case. Drainage improvements were made to address runoff. No marker was placed. The absence was deliberate, consistent with county policy against memorializing crime scenes. The decision reflected a preference for normalcy over fixation. In the archives, the Harper file was relocated from active shelving to closed cases. Its spine bore dates, charges, and disposition. Digital copies were backed up according to retention schedules. Physical items designated for destruction were disposed of under witness, while items required for long-term retention were sealed. The process took hours, then ended. Years later, when questions arise about cold cases and their viability, Emily Harper's case is cited sparingly, not as a miracle but as a lesson in restraint. Evidence was collected without assumptions. Suspects were interviewed without coercion. Leads were logged without judgment. Time did not improve memories, but it improved tools, and the case waited. For Emily's parents, the aftermath was private. They sold the family home and downsized. Holiday routines changed shape. The room that had been kept unchanged was eventually repurposed, not as erasure but as acceptance. They attended the scholarship ceremony once, then asked not to be invited again. Their grief had found its own boundaries. The final appellate review affirmed the conviction. The opinion addressed claims of delay and degradation, finding neither prejudicial nor dispositive. The ruling closed the judicial door fully. No further motions altered the outcome. In Hollow Creek, the case occupies a quiet place in local history. It is recalled without embellishment, anchored to dates and documents. It stands as evidence that methodical work, sustained across seasons and years, can reach an answer without spectacle. The town continues, marked by winters and holidays, carrying forward a resolved past and the steady confidence that careful records can speak when time finally allows. The men who had followed the investigation from its beginning often described the ending as properly ordinary. There were no parades, no declarations, and no claim that justice had erased loss. Instead, there was a recognition that systems function best when they resist urgency. Training sessions at the sheriff's office referenced the case to illustrate report writing standards, evidence labeling, and the discipline of revisiting assumptions. Younger deputies learned how early conclusions can narrow options, and how restraint preserves possibilities. County budgets reflected the reality of long investigations. Overtime entries from 1992 were preserved alongside modern grant reimbursements used for DNA testing decades later. Accountants reconciled costs with outcomes, noting that preservation, though expensive, was less costly than error. The lesson was recorded without rhetoric. The press maintained its tone. A final follow-up article summarized the sentence, the appellate affirmation, and the scholarship fund. It avoided photographs. Readers were older men who appreciated facts over commentary. Letters that arrived afterward were brief, expressing relief rather than celebration. Environmental data appended to the case file included archived weather maps, snowfall measurements, and temperature logs. These records, once marginal, had supported the reconstruction of tire impressions and time windows. Their inclusion underscored the value of comprehensive documentation, even when relevance is not immediately apparent. The legal record preserved the jury instructions verbatim. They emphasized burden of proof, the evaluation of circumstantial evidence, and the need to consider the totality rather than any single item. Post-verdict interviews were not conducted, consistent with local practice. The verdict stood on the record alone. As years pass, the community's relationship to the case becomes quieter. New residents encounter it only through occasional mention. Longtime residents recall it as a period when routines were interrupted and later restored. The town's identity remains defined by continuity rather than the crime. At the state facility, Reed's status settled into the structure of incarceration. Annual reviews noted compliance and age-related health concerns. None of these entries altered the sentence. The record remained factual, procedural, and complete. The final line in the case summary is unadorned. It states that Emily Harper's homicide was solved through lawful evidence, preserved across time, adjudicated by a jury, and affirmed on review. It lists the date of closure and the signatures of those responsible. There are no adjectives. Winter lights continue to glow each December. Thanksgiving tables fill. New Year calendars turn. In Hollow Creek, the seasons proceed with the assurance that some questions, once answered, do not need repeating. The record holds. The past rests. Archival practice required one final step. Metadata fields were completed to ensure future retrieval accuracy. Keywords included location, year, victim age, cause, and disposition. Cross-references linked the case to forensic method updates and statutory changes. The file's presence in the system would aid pattern analysis without reopening settled facts. Community education materials reference the case indirectly, focusing on reporting protocols and the importance of timely information. There was no reenactment. The emphasis remained on process. A generation that remembered the winter of 1992 aged forward. Conversations about the case, when they occurred, were measured. The community preferred lessons over stories. The conclusion, written plainly, acknowledged the limits of resolution. A conviction does not restore a life. It confirms responsibility. It documents truth as supported by evidence. It closes a chapter without claiming completeness. In that restraint lies the character of the place and the case. Careful work, preserved across time, delivered an answer when the tools became sufficient. Nothing more is required. The archive now sits alongside others, equal in treatment, distinct in facts. Its value is instructional rather than exceptional. The town continues to measure itself by seasons and service, confident that diligence, not drama, defines outcomes. With the record complete, the story ends where it should, in documentation and quiet certainty. This certainty is modest, earned through verification and maintained through respect for limits. It is not closure in the emotional sense, but closure in the civic one, sufficient for history and instruction and appropriate for remembrance without spectacle. Nothing further remains pending. The docket is clear. The file is closed. Time proceeds, orderly and unremarkable as it should. Records remain. Lessons endure. The town moves forward with care, memory, and measured confidence. Winter returns quietly, reliably, endures still.